They say the forest remembers, even when the world forgets. But some memories are soaked in blood. Before the world learned to whisper about colonialism, before the British flag was planted in the bones of Africa, there was a people, a secretive force cloaked in shadow, diplomacy, and spiritual power. A people whose influence stretched not by chains or rifles, but by fear, strategy, and something darker. This is the story of the Aro Confederacy, a story buried deep in the southeastern wilds of what we now call Nigeria. At the heart of it all was Aruku, a city-state carved into the hills like a crown of thorns. To outsiders, Aruku was a place of culture, commerce, and religion, but beneath its grandeur pulsed something more ominous, an empire built on mystery, blood oaths, and manipulation of the unseen. The Aro were not conquerors by sword alone. No, they ruled with silence. They ruled with fear, and above all, they ruled with belief, twisting spirituality into something that held tribes and kingdoms hostage in their own minds. For generations, they thrived, hidden behind trade routes, cloaked in priestly robes, making kings kneel without raising a single blade. But empires, no matter how clever, rot from the inside first. Tonight, we peel back the veil. We go back in time to when power was neither white nor black, but shadow, when gods were invoked not with prayer, but with blood, and when betrayal came not from the enemy, but from the mirror. This isn't the history you'll find in textbooks. This is a tale whispered by firelight, a legend older than borders and darker than night. So if you're drawn to the untold, if you crave stories where spirits move through the living, where minds are broken before bodies fall, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Folktales Cinema. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, share it if the shadows move you, and subscribe to uncover the haunted history our ancestors dared not write. Tell us in the comments, do you believe a kingdom can fall, not from war, but from within? Now sit still, breathe slowly, because once this story begins, there's no turning back. There's a kind of power that doesn't shout. It doesn't raise swords. It doesn't storm cities. It whispers. It waits. And when the time is right, it moves the world. That was the power of the Aro Confederacy. In the lush, humid lowlands of southeastern Nigeria, hidden beneath the dense canopy and wrapped in rivers and trade routes, the Aro weren't just a people, they were a force, a quiet empire, an invisible kingdom, and they had mastered the art of control without the need for war. At least, not at first. They wore two faces to the world: merchants by daylight, priests by candlelight. They traded in palm oil, in ivory, and in something far more sinister: people. Human lives, stolen, broken, and sold to feed the ever-growing European appetite for control and profit. But while the trade routes moved goods, the real engine behind Aro power was fear and faith. You see, to the people of the land, the Aro were not just traders. They were spiritual gatekeepers. They spoke through oracles. They whispered prophecies. They made kings tremble and villages obey. Their spiritual center, the dreaded shrine at Arochukwu, was a place no man questioned, because those who went in rarely came out. They had managed to wrap an entire region in invisible chains. And it worked for centuries. But the world was changing. Far across the seas, a different kind of empire had been growing, one that didn't just believe it had the right to conquer, but believed it had a duty to civilize. That was the twisted gospel of the British Empire. And by the late 1800s, they were no longer just traders on African shores. They had become invaders, colonizers, engineers of control. By this time, they had already claimed vast swaths of Nigeria's coast: Lagos, Calabar, Port Harcourt. They built ports, laid down railways, and planted flags. The palm oil that once enriched African kingdoms now fattened British companies, and the thirst for expansion had only grown stronger. But there was a problem, a single, stubborn, defiant problem: the Aro Confederacy. To the British, the Aro weren't just another local power. They were a strategic nightmare. Despite their size, the Aro had managed to resist occupation, avoid direct confrontation, and maintain a complex, deeply rooted system of political and spiritual control across vast regions. It drove the British mad. They couldn't move goods inland without permission, couldn't manipulate local chiefs without Aro interference, couldn't spread Christianity without pushing up against Aro spirituality. And worst of all, the people still believed in them. The British, with all their guns and ships and proclamations, couldn't compete with the whispered fear of the Aro Oracle. So they tried diplomacy, letters, meetings, proposals. But the Aro weren't interested in being anyone's subject. They had ruled their way for centuries. Why should that change now? And so, the British got impatient. By the dawn of the 20th century, there was a cold fury boiling beneath the polished surface of British diplomacy. They weren't just merchants or governors anymore. They had become an empire that believed in its divine right to control. And as long as the Aro Confederacy stood, their rule over Nigeria was incomplete. It wasn't about trade anymore. It was about domination. In London, in secret war rooms, the decision was made. The language softened it. They called it a punitive expedition. But it was war. A calculated, brutal, premeditated war. They weren't just going to pacify the region. They were going to shatter it, burn it, replace it. And in 1901, they made their move. The target was clear. Arochukwu, the heart of Aro power. A city hidden deep in the southeastern forests, fortified not just by men and walls, but by generations of belief. To attack it was to desecrate a spiritual system, a cultural pillar. But the British didn't care. They saw shrines as superstition, oracles as obstacles, and resistance as rebellion. They mobilized troops under the command of Major Arthur Leonard and Lieutenant Colonel H.M. Trenchard. Thousands of soldiers, cannons, machine guns, supplies, carriers, guides, spies. It was a full-scale invasion. But here's what they didn't fully understand. They weren't just marching on a town. They were marching into a labyrinth of alliances, superstitions, terrain traps, and deeply rooted loyalty. The Aro Confederacy was not a single city-state. It was a network stretching across Igbo land, connected by kinship, trade, and ancient secrets. And so, as British forces advanced through the villages and roads leading to Arochukwu, they met resistance. Not in the form of grand armies, but in ambushes, disappearances, sabotage supplies, whispers in the dark. The land itself seemed to turn against them. But the British had something the Aro didn't: modern firepower, and the determination to erase anything that stood in their way. Village by village, they advanced. Houses were burned, shrines desecrated. Those who fought were killed. Those who fled were hunted. The jungle was filled with smoke and gunfire. And finally, they reached Arochukwu. Now, to understand what happened next, you have to understand what Arochukwu meant. It wasn't just the capital, it was the soul of the Confederacy. It housed the Abini Ukpabi, the feared oracle, also known as the Long Juju, a place where verdicts were given, where enemies disappeared, where the boundary between life and death felt thin. The British knew this, and they didn't just want to conquer the town, they wanted to destroy the oracle, to sever the people's connection to their power. So they bombed it. What happened in those final days has been half silenced by history, half screamed in oral tradition. Some say the priests tried to defend the shrine with charms and chants. Some say there were last-minute pacts with other villages, desperate counterattacks. Others say the shrine was empty, its secrets already hidden deep underground. But one thing is certain, the Long Juju fell. The British breached the oracle's walls. They tore apart the sacred grounds. Statues were smashed, symbols desecrated, the spiritual heart of a civilization gone. And just like that, the Aro Confederacy, after centuries of influence, began to unravel. The network of alliances that once spanned across the region collapsed. Without their spiritual anchor, many vassal towns submitted. Chiefs were replaced. Schools and churches were introduced. British flags were planted. Roads were laid. Taxes were demanded. And the people? They mourned in silence. To the empire, it was a victory, but to the land, it was a loss that would echo for generations. Yet even in defeat, the Aro spirit did not vanish. Their legacy lived on in whispered prayers, in secret rites, in the stubbornness of those who still refuse to forget. You see, power can be buried, but it doesn't die. It waits. And sometimes, it returns. This is just the beginning. They came with guns, marching through a land they did not understand, armed with steel and arrogance. The British believed their empire was invincible. They had faced resistance before, for yes, but nothing, they thought, that raw firepower couldn't silence. They were wrong, because in the shadowy forests of southeastern Nigeria, they were walking into something far older than colonial ambition. They were walking into the heart of a people who had seen the storm coming and had chosen to face it standing, the Aro Confederacy. To the British, they were an obstacle, but to their people, they were guardians, keepers of history, of spiritual order, and of balance. The Aro were not just warriors. They were priests, philosophers, masters of terrain and mind, and they knew this day would come. Word of the British conquest had traveled like smoke through the trees. Towns burned, chiefs imprisoned, cultures erased in the name of empire. The Aro had listened, they had watched, and when the invasion moved toward their sacred heartland, they did not run, they prepared. They did not see themselves as mere defenders. They were protectors of a sacred way of life, of the spirits that dwelled in stone and river, of pacts made in blood and bone. They knew if Ru-1 Ochukwu fell, so too would the soul of their world. Colonel F.J. Dlog had his orders: crush the Confederacy, break their will, plant the Union Jack where oracles once whispered. He came with thousands, cannons, rifles, gunpowder, and drills, boots striking the red earth in cruel rhythm. He believed victory was only a matter of time. But war is not won on paper. The Aro did not meet him in the open. They vanished into the land they knew like breath to wind. At night, British supply lines vanished. Entire squads disappeared in the underbrush, ambushed by warriors who seemed to rise from the earth itself. By day, the jungle mocked them, silent, watching, never revealing the next trap. They moved like ghosts, their blades silent, their eyes sharp. They struck with precision and vanished before the echoes died. Every warrior was guided by more than rage. They were guided by faith. The chief priest did not just pray, they strategized. They read the skies, cast bones, communed with forces older than empire. And the oracle, the oracle, she was no myth. She was the voice of the ancestors, walking among the living. When she spoke, warriors listened. When she wept, mothers hid their children. Her visions did not falter. She had seen the flames. She had seen betrayal. But she had also seen courage rise in the ashes. The Aro fought not for victory. They fought because they had no choice. This was their land, their soul, their story. And stories like theirs are not easily erased. For months, the British stumbled in a war they could not understand. Yes, their guns could pierce flesh, but they could not kill spirits. They could not map a land alive with defiance. And slowly, frustration crept in. Some soldiers whispered of the land being cursed. Others grew sick, not of illness, but of fear. Yet time, as always, was cruel. The Aro were brave, but they were few. Ammunition ran low, food dwindled. Their warriors, once invisible phantoms, began to tire. Still, they pressed on. Still, they believed. But the British were patient, and they were many. Reinforcements came like waves. More boots, more guns, more blood. The noose tightened. Village by village, the outer shills of the Confederacy cracked. Forests were burned, sacred groves desecrated. And finally, the road to Ru-1 Ochukwu, holy capital, spiritual core, was open. It was 1902. The air was thick with grief and smoke, but the Aro did not flee. They had buried too many sons, wept for too many fathers. There would be no surrender. As the British approached the gates, they expected one final ambush. What they found instead was resistance that bordered on madness. Men, bloodied but unbroken, charged against gunfire. Women, priests, and even children wailed war songs passed down from forgotten ancestors. They fought not just with weapons, but with ritual, with prayer, with fury. And in the center of it all, the oracle stood beneath the sacred tree of judgment, her face streaked with ash and tears, calling on the spirits to make their final stand. Bullets tore through the sacred groves. Shrines were toppled, but still they fought. Still they believed. It is said that when the final shrine fell, a great wind tore through the capital, not natural but ancient, the last breath of a dying city, or the scream of something eternal. When the British finally took Aro War, they did not cheer. They walked through ruins, not victory, through the shattered bones of a people who refused to be erased, and the land has never forgotten. Even now, in the deep silence of night, the trees in Aro War whisper, not of defeat, but of warning. You see, the Aro did not vanish. Their story still lives. And so, the drums fell silent. Aruku, the proud heart of a forgotten empire, was brought to its knees. The once whispered names of oracles and warlords now echoed only in the chambers of colonial prisons or the far corners of exile. The British took the land. They silenced the temples. They replaced sacred authority with cold foreign rule. And they believed that by shattering the Aro Confederacy, they could erase its memory. But they were wrong. Because what they could never understand, what every empire has always failed to grasp, is that you can break a body, but not a spirit. You can burn down shrines, but not the stories carved into the soul of a people. Y'all, the Aro didn't just fall, they became legend. In their defeat, they planted something far more dangerous than rebellion. They planted memory, a seed buried deep in the minds of their descendants. The kind of memory that stirs quietly in silence until the day it rises again. The Anglo-Aro War wasn't just the end of a kingdom, it was the beginning of an awakening. Long before Nigerian independence became a movement, long before national flags replaced colonial ones, there were warriors who refused to kneel, who fought not for power, but for identity. And though history books may try to compress it into footnotes, this was resistance in its purest form. So now we ask you, if your home, your gods, your name were threatened, would you fight for them, even if you knew you'd lose? Let us know in the comments. Would you choose survival under chains or freedom, even in death? If this story gripped you, if it stirred something inside you that still doesn't have words, then don't let it end here. Like the video, share it, and subscribe to Folktales Cinema, where every week we bring back the shadows history tried to forget. Turn on the bell, not just to get notified, but to keep these stories alive. Because in every tale of defeat lies a warning, and in every echo of the past, a future waiting to be shaped. This was the fall of the Aro Confederacy, but it will not be forgotten. Not here. Not now. Not ever.